Greetings, everybody. Today we're talking about the concept of apotheosis. What does apotheosis mean? It means that the process of becoming a god. So the idea being that someone who wasn't a god does something, has an experience, accomplishes something, and becomes a god. So we're interested in the aspects, or what aspects of Roman society led to the possibility that Roman emperors and other people on a regular basis could have an apotheosis after they died. For the emperors, we know that 52 in all became gods. The Romans didn't have a sharp polarity between gods and humans like you would find in, say, Christianity, where the deity is completely transcendent. For them, there was a spectrum between the human and the divine. Some gods were just not so transcendent and far removed as other gods were. So the Romans allowed themselves the possibility that some among us could rise in the spectrum. People could become divine or quasi divine. And this manifests itself in three entry points in Roman culture or thought. In other words, there are three entry points allowing for this. One, I would say here at the top of the slide, is the cult of the dead. When people died, as you know, they joined a group of spirits called the daemones, underworld spirits, who had the potential to do good or evil. And since ancestors were likely to look after their family, their descendants, their loved ones, the Romans would worship them or carry out cultic practices on their behalf to keep them on their side. The parentale, you recall, is the picnic at the tombs to try to appease the ancestors. Oh, you're being involved in a family picnic. The feralia, which occurs at the end of the Parentalia on February 21st, the Parentalia being a longer festival, but at the end, on February 21st, there are sacrifices made at the tombs to the dead ancestors. Even Aeneas, who founded the Roman race in Virgil's Aeneid, he does this for his father. Ovid, the poet, tells us of neglect and how the ghosts took to the streets howling and angry like wolves when people didn't sacrifice to their dead ancestors. So that's the first entry point in the thinking of the Romans for someone becoming a god. The second is that great leaders could become gods. Some of these leaders in the Roman legend were mythical, such as Romulus, Aeneas, Latinus, who was king of the Latins, father of Lavinia, whom Aeneas married. He married into the Latins, merging the Trojan races and the Latin races. So these guys were transformed into gods long before the emperors came along. This happened to Romulus near the end of his reign as founder and first king of Rome. He had become engaged in a fierce battle with Veii, one of the most powerful towns in Etruria. And one day he was holding a review of his army on a plain near Lake Capra, and the sky was suddenly overcast with gloom and a tempest of thunder and lightning. The people fled in dismay, and when the storm abated, Romulus, over whose head it had raged most fiercely, was nowhere to be seen. A rumor was circulated that during the tempest he had been carried to heaven by his father, the god Mars. This opinion was speedily confirmed by the report of a certain Julius Proculus, who declared that as he was returning by night from Alba Longa to Rome, Romulus appeared to him in a form of more than mortal majesty and bade him go and tell the Romans that Rome was destined by the gods to be the chief city of the earth, that human power could never withstand her people, and that he himself would be, Romulus, would be their guardian, taking on the name Quirinus, who was already a Sabine god, which the Romans had borrowed from the nearby Sabine people. Eventually, he was merged with Mars, or thought to be the son of Mars. And so Romulus becomes somehow the god Quirinus, the son of Mars. There's also Aeneas, whom we talk about a lot in this class. He was the Trojan who fled Troy after the city fell to the Greeks, came to Rome with a band of merry men, and founded the Roman race through a lot of alliances and so forth. And in a battle to try to consolidate his power there, a battle with a certain group called the Rutilians, who were assisted by the Etruscans, he fell in battle. His body wasn't found on the battlefield anywhere, and so it was believed that he had been carried up to heaven. So, we have biblical figures like this. Think of who the four I can think of, actually, biblical figures who were just taken up into heaven. They didn't go through the death and the burial and all that. One was Enoch, right? He was, and then he was with God. Elisha, Moses, Jesus, after he was buried, resurrected. As he was resurrected, he ascended up into heaven. So, there's precedent for that even in the Bible, but the Romans definitely had their own stories of people who just kind of disappeared, really, and so it was assumed they went up to be with the gods. So they were great leaders, but also a third category I would call successful politicians. Now we moved out of legend and into history, and these successful politicians were those who were viewed as working in tandem with the gods to ensure the well-being of Rome. Sometimes this was played up to the max by the politicians themselves. One example of this is Scipio Africanus. Now, he was the one who conquered Hannibal in the Second Punic War. And like the Greek Macedonian leader Philip, whose wife Olympias had had an encounter with a snake and then gave birth to Alexander the Great, the story was circulated that Scipio's mother, who was long sterile, one night when her husband was away, a huge snake slithered into the room and climbed into her bed. She shrieked, and the snake vanished. Mr. Scipio consulted the haruspices when he came home about this, and they held a sacrifice and said that children would be born. She gave birth to Scipio, who obviously must be descended from a god, right? So the Scipio, when he grew up, played this up. He used to get up in the dead of night and go to the Capitol, to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and have the inner cell opened up for him by the temple attendants. He would sit there for a long time as if he were consulting Jupiter about the state of the Republic. The caretakers of the temple were astonished that the temple guard dogs never barked or rushed at Scipio despite the time of night, although they always had savaged everybody else. And Marius, who in the first century defeated both the African king Jugurtha and German invaders, he was another successful politician. And the people normally would have expressed their gratitude to the gods for their helps, like Sternium, that sort of thing. But they so admired what Marius had done, working in tandem with the gods, that they offered food and libations to him along with the gods. And then you have two other major leaders in the first century BC, Sulla and Pompey. And both of those vied for the support of Venus. You recall that Pompey had built that temple theater complex to Venus Victrix, Venus the Victress. She brings victories to the Roman people. But then Caesar won out in that regard, and he built a temple complex to Venus Genetrix, Venus the ancestor of his family line, the Julian line. You see, the son of Aeneas had the name Iulus, and so the Julians trace their lineage back, all the way back to Aeneas, who was the child of Venus. And so that's how he could claim to be a descendant of Venus. So that what I'm saying is there's an effort to ever more closely associate oneself with the gods, and especially to Venus as the mother of the Roman race. At least in those last two groups, Sulla, Pompey, Julius Caesar, trying to say, oh, Venus is supporting us. The sequence of coinage of the late Republic, we're talking about 44 BC, somewhere around there, provides a good index of the gradual assimilation of rulers to divine roles. Caesar was following his ancestors and advertising the Julian family's descent from Venus here on this coin. It was said that Julius Caesar was absolutely devoted to Venus, and according to one historian, wanted to persuade everybody that he had received from her a kind of youthful radiance. So in 46 BC, he built that temple that we talked about to Venus Genetrix, lavished it with treasures. He took it so far that Cicero, when he would write letters to his friends, started joking, referring to Julius Caesar as that guy who descended from Venus. So this coin right here is a break from tradition. Normally the Romans didn't put their heads on coins, not in this Republican period. But here's Julius Caesar putting his head on the coin, near the end of his life, of course. But he's saying, I'm something special. Here is his mom, basically, is on the back of the coin. There's Venus, and she's holding victory in her hand. So, I'm not just a normal human being. Normally, only gods appear on the coin, but here I am, Julius Caesar. I am worthy of appearing on the coin. Here's another similar coin, and in fact, you see a star on the back behind Caesar's head, which seems to be a symbol of his new status as a god. Here is another coin with Caesar and Venus, the victor, with a shield. We don't think of Venus as somebody who holds a shield or spear or anything like that. There's a helmet, it looks like, maybe down there. At any rate, she doesn't wear this weaponry ever because her attribute is to be very erotic, charming, and so she barely wears any clothes. Sometimes she's naked on these coins. and yet uh, in the role of a protector, like a bird protecting its nest, she is ferocious. She's protecting the Roman people, her children. So she will have this weaponry around her. Here's a coin from 216 AD, Emperor Caracalla. So here she seems to be holding a scepter. I don't think that that's a spear, but she does have a shield. She defends the Roman people. Sometimes she's got the captive. I think that's a shield at the bottom. Um, uh, I mean, I think that's a helmet at the bottom of her shield there. But she holds in her hand, in her right hand, she holds the goddess Nike or Victory. Here's a coin of Trajan depicting the temple of Venus Genetrix. The coin dates to about 117 AD, but this was vowed by Julius Caesar in 48 BC and dedicated in 46 BC as the temple to Venus Genetrix. The temple itself appeared in the Forum of Julius Caesar, which had been built around 54 BC, or that's when buildings started going into it. We see the Temple of Venus Genetrix. This is what remains of it. It's in the front part of the Forum. There was a statue of Caesar riding Bucephalus, who was the horse of Alexander the Great, symbolizing absolute power. So great rulers, you see, are doing great things for the people, and so they are thought of as gods. So the question is, how did benefaction, doing great things for the people, get connected to apotheosis? What was it about the mindset of the Romans that made them think that great benefactors deserve to be gods? I mean, as Americans, we have great benefactors, but we don't think of them as gods. How did the Romans make that leap? Well, we do know that more and more people were beginning to connect benefaction to divinity. You remember from earlier in the course Cicero's remark that if the gods don't give us stuff, peace, security, prosperity, whatever it might be, then we don't owe them any worship. It's not just because they're our creators that we worship them, not because they're holy, not because we just admire them so much. Cicero is saying we worship the gods primarily because they give us stuff. It's a reciprocal kind of relationship. You give us stuff, we give you stuff. We're in this sort of community together of supporting each other. The Roman poet Lucretius, who wrote a poem about Epicureanism, if you can believe it, kind of a didactic poem, in other words, a poem that teaches. He speaks a lot about his hero, who's Epicurus, who founded the philosophy of Epicureanism. Lucretius at some point burst out in praise of Epicurus. He's long dead, but uh, Lucretius is just thinking about him, and he says he's writing. Lucretius has dedicated this book to a guy named Memmius, who was a general at Rome. Um, anyway, he writes. He says he was a god, Memmius, a god who first discovered that principle of life, which is now called wisdom, who by his art rescued human life from storms and darkness, and settled it in a clear, still light. So you can see in Lucretius, there's this mindset that he did something, and so now he can call him a god. It just burst out of him. He's a god. Look what he did for us. In 86 BC, we see another example of this. There was a praetor, not extremely important. His name was Marius Gratidianus. He was the nephew, though, of the dictator Marius, who was briefly dictator during that time. There was this period you see in the late Republic before Julius Caesar came on the scene. We had Marius and Sulla. Both of them had won great military victories, and they tried to seize power at Rome, but it didn't last long for either one of them. Marius, though, had a nephew, Marius Gratidianus, and he had carried out some popular and much needed currency reforms. And we're told that the city broke out in spontaneous demonstrations in which statues of him were set up throughout the city, and he was honored with incense and wine as a savior god. Also, when Augustus Caesar returned from abroad after settling all wars, the same kind of spirit of enthusiasm broke out. This is later in the first century BC. And one author of the time writes, there was nothing that men could ask of gods, nothing that the gods could offer to men, nothing that prayer could conceive of, nothing that ultimate bliss could achieve, which was not vouchsafed to the state, to the people, to the world by Augustus after his return to Rome. Cicero's words still echo to anyone who had lived during the 50s and 40s. The reversal of fortune that Augustus had brought about was a miracle and blessings. And these miracles, these benefits prove divinity. Even in the case of the way that the early Christians thought about Jesus, there's one Christian writer, Arnobius, says this: are we not then to regard Christ as a God and to give him the greatest worship paid to divinity that we can devise, since we have long received great blessings from him and await yet greater ones? End of quote. So above all, God is a savior. We were in the pit of despair, and he gave us hope for a better life. He brings miraculous benefits, and that equals divinity, and that deserves worship. So Cicero writes in a very famous passage of his work, as part of a larger work. It's called The Dream of Scipio. This very important sentence, quote, to all who have saved, helped, or advanced their country, a fixed place is assigned in heaven in which they shall enjoy everlasting bliss. End of quote. That's just one person talking, Cicero's view, but we can see that it's reflected in uh, other things that are happening, uh, other reactions to great benefaction at the time. It was definitely a mindset running throughout Rome. Now, it was clear that Caesar, before his assassination, had determined to claim divine status for himself. He may well have felt that it would help to authenticate and justify the absolute monarchy, which he realized was the only answer to Rome's perennial quarrels and disputes. In May 45, his statue was set up in the temple of Quirinus. Remember, Quirinus and Romulus had become identified as one divinity. And there was an inscription along with his statue, to the unconquered God. Later, statues were erected in temples throughout Italy. Games were established in his honor. The month of Quintilis was changed to July, Julius Caesar, you see. Finally, a temple to Caesar and his clemency was decreed. I don't think it was ever built, but it was going to be built, showing Julius Caesar holding hands with clemency. He had shown mercy to his opponents. So it was decreed, and there was going to be a special priest of divine Julius. And eventually there was such a priest, a flamen, actually, one of those old-timey priests that the Romans had after he was killed. After Julius Caesar was assassinated, this flamen was set up. That was the first one the Romans could remember being created in historical times, and it was being created for a human being, but a special human being, Julius Caesar, who could have a star on the back of his coin, remember. Eventually, it was Mark Antony who became the first flamen of Julius Caesar. His efforts to be divine, however, Julius Caesar's efforts to be divine were frustrated by his death, but his example was followed by Antony, who began to pose as the new Dionysus. He made a triumphal tour of the East, Antony did, in the years from 41 BC onward. In Ephesus, we're told that women clothed as Bacchants, the followers of Dionysus, and men and boys like satyrs and Pans, other followers of Dionysus, led the way before him, while the city echoed with pipes, harps. That comes from Plutarch, by the way. In Athens, Antony dressed himself up as Dionysus and conducted day-long revels on the Acropolis. The Athenians unwisely flattered his whim by offering the goddess Athena to him in marriage. Not kidding. He accepted on the spot and exacted a dowry of $1 million or so, what we would think of as $1 million. So all this sounds bizarre, but should be remembered that Antony's sphere of influence was the East after Julius Caesar died. Augustus had the West, and that Cleopatra, who as queen was reverenced in Egypt, that is in the East, you see, as a goddess. She was his consort in these days. So if he's going to be with a goddess, he needs to be a god, and so he chose Dionysus. Octavian, later to be Augustus, used his own heroic portrait as a coin type and added his now deified father, divine Julius, to the traditional claim of divine ancestry through Venus. So it was in 42 BC that the Senate passed the official consecration of Caesar, including the building of a temple to divine Julius. And it was in 40 BC that Antony was inaugurated as the first flamen of divine Julius. I think he had been appointed to that office in 44 BC, right before Julius Caesar died, but he wasn't consecrated or inaugurated until 40 BC. And finally, in 29 BC, Augustus appointed a new flamen in place of Antony and dedicated the temple to Caesar, divine Caesar, an event celebrated with lavish gifts. The temple was on the south side of the Roman Forum, kind of forming a backdrop for public speakers. The tribunal put in front of it. statue of Caesar put there. So Caesar now had a divine status. He's got a temple in the Forum. He's got a statue. He's got uh, priest, all that sort of thing. Supposedly, Julius Caesar appeared to Cassius, one of his assassins, at the Battle of Philippi to tell the assassin that he had not actually killed Julius Caesar because its divinity could never be extinguished. From the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus onwards, emperors and some of the members of their immediate families were the most frequent category of recruits to the Roman pantheon. After the death of an emperor, the Senate would take a vote as to whether or not he had been a deserving ruler, whether there had been enough benefaction, and they should formally recognize him as a god. Though, of course, the dead man's successor would have a big role to play in such a decision. Divus, divine, diva, if it's a woman, wife of an emperor, would be added to their name. I mentioned just a few minutes ago that Octavian had coins in which he uh, presented himself in a divine-like way. In fact, he took on the guise of one of the traditional gods. He, in some of his coins, would dress up as Neptune, the god of the sea. And here's an example of that. This is Octavian, later to become Augustus, and here is Neptune on the back of the coin. And then here's another coin of Octavian with um, Venus on the back, and you can see that she's holding a helmet, she's got a scepter, and there's a shield down behind her. Her clothes are dropping off, she's semi-naked, but she does have that defensive weaponry. I just want to say a word before we end this about two more things. The cult of virtues, this was connected with the deification of people as well, emperors and their wives. And also, I want to say a word about triumphs. Both of those things are connected to the apotheosis idea. The cult of virtues is not something that we hear much about or think much about, but it was very important to the Romans, especially in the imperial period. It was played up very much by the emperors. Uh, Virtues, not in the sense that we think of the word virtues as moral qualities that a person could have, but virtus in Latin means a power, and so the cult of virtues is the cult of powers that are abstract ideas and powers. And so the Romans not only worshipped divinities who are more, say, um, human-like, anthropomorphic, human-shaped, but also they worshipped abstract ideas. Everything could be worshipped. Anything could be worshipped. Any force that's out there that the Romans want to try to appease, control, manipulate, have a relationship with, and eventually it was thought that the emperors, being above the average person and being closer to the gods and on their way to divinity, a lot of them had a special relationship with these powers. These powers could be channeled through them. So we see a lot of coins in which the emperors will put on their coin an image of one of these virtues or powers, and they're trying to say, look, I have a special, um, unusual amount of this force or power that we so desire and try to honor and manipulate and bring to positive effect for the Roman people. I have a special measure of it which channels through me down to the people. And so they would use it as a kind of propaganda to say, here's what I'm doing for you. So about these um, virtues, I put a handout up into your Blackboard. If you'll download it. It's got some nice quotes about virtues from various authors, Juvenal, Cicero, the Christian author we just talked about, Arnobius, another Christian author, Lactantius, and they're very informative about what sorts of things end up in the cult of virtues. Just to read you a short passage that I have there from Juvenal to get us warmed up on this idea. I'll just read that first passage that's on the handout. To us Romans, the most revered majesty is that of riches. The Juvenal writes satires. He's being very critical of the Romans here, making fun of them. Riches, that's what you really care about. That's the power that everybody wants. And surprised that you have no temple to call home yet, poisonous money, and that we haven't erected altars to the almighty dollar as of yet, like we have the peace and faith, victory and virtue and concord, whose temple resounds with the noise of storks returning to their nests. So I think the stork idea there is talking about some neglect on the part of the Romans to keep their temples clear and clean. But what's of interest here to us is that there are temples, you see, to ideas, abstract ideas like peace, faith, which I would call trustworthiness, uh, victory, virtue, which I would say could be translated manliness, and concord or harmony. So these are just a handful of the virtues that could be mentioned and worshipped and even have temples for the Romans. Well, now we're not going to try to trace all of them, but I just want you to see a few coins actually that have some of these abstract ideas on it. So this is a coin of Numerian 283 to 284 AD. So he's a later emperor. He helped his father Carus win a major victory against the Persians in the east. And so we see this coin. He's got a spear in his hand on the front of the coin, and you see a shield in front of his shoulder there. So there's Numerian, but on the back of the coin, you see a figure. Could be any figure, but she has some attributes that help identify who she is, and fortunately, her name is written on the coin itself. Now you see the AUG, and that means august, to be revered, in other words. PAX, Pax, peace. So here is a coin depicting a personified peace. She's holding an olive branch and she's holding a scepter. And so what Numerian is saying is that Pax worked through me to bring about the peace that she so wants to give to the Roman people. Another kind of virtue that you see out there actually has the word virtus in it. Virtus exercitus, you can see on the back of the coin going around. That means the manliness of the army. And we see this is a coin of Julian the second, or what he's known as Julian the Apostate. He was the last of the pagan emperors. He tried to reinstate pagan religion after Christianity got hold. But here we have a coin, a figure on the back, kind of weaponry and a shield and victory in the hand, and then the soldier standing there. But the virtus exercitus means manliness of the army, the bravery of the army. And so that is an abstract idea, but it's been personified, you see, and turned into something that can be honored. And Julian the Apostate says that he is channeling through him. A really nice coin of Herenia Etruscilla, 249 to 251, a wife of Decius. Now, Decius was a terrible persecutor of Christians, but that didn't stop his wife from producing a coin. And on the back, you can see what virtus it is that she wants to promote, what virtue it is she's trying to say that she has a special portion of, and that is Pudicitia. Again, this is August Pudicitia being modesty. And you can see the goddess sitting in the chair, and she's got very delicately portrayed a veil that she is pulling over her head in modesty. So modesty being important, you don't want the people of Rome to go off the rails. And so she demonstrates and channels and has a special portion of or special measure of this virtue, modesty, which she shares with the Roman people. And here's a coin of Claudius, a beautiful bronze Sestertius, first century BC. And on the back of the coin, you can see what it is Claudius is bringing to the Roman people, what virtue is being channeled through Claudius. And that's written on the left side of the back of the coin, Spes. Augusta Spes is a big coin. So plenty of room to write out the word Augusta. August Hope, and there she is personified. So that gives you a flavor of what the virtues were like. Let's move on now to the triumph. Just a few words about the triumph, kind of a general overview, and then I think I put another handout up on Blackboard um, with a passage about the triumph. Someone describing a triumph. So triumphs also had the effect of bringing great leaders in close association with the gods. The great achievements of great generals in the fields could lead to their becoming, at least symbolically or temporarily, a god. Whenever some general you see had a great victory over a major army, he could be invited with his army to Rome by the Senate. The general would meet his army outside the city walls, and there they would request a meeting with the Senate. The senators would come outside the walls, and there they would hear the case of why the general deserved a triumph. And if they granted a triumph, then a special celebration would take place. Well, what does it take to have a triumph, and what is it like to have one? Well, what it takes to have one is to win that great victory over another people, not just a small skirmish or a battle, but like to defeat a foreign enemy. So if you got your triumph, it was a special day, and all the temples were thrown open, garlands of flowers decorating every shrine and image, incense burning on all the altars, and so forth. And the general gets to have a cantio, a speech, where he commends the valor of the troops. He distributes rewards and money to each individual. You can imagine that this was a fun event, especially if you got a reward. He then he then ascends a triumphal car, kind of roundish, pulled by four white horses, and advances through the triumphal gate, the Porta Triumphalis, where he is met by the senators and the magistrates, trumpeters leading the way. Uh, Plus, there's a huge, magnificent train of all the spoils captured in war on wagons, on platforms, including anything, even money, statues, weapons, art. Flute players would follow with the bulls that are going to be sacrificed, strange animals that come from the location. It could be elephants or anything like that. The insignia of the enemy, their flags, their standards, then the leaders of the enemies and the captives, and so forth. The general himself would be attired in gold embroidered, uh, in a gold embroidered robe and a flowered tunic. He carried a laurel branch in one hand, a scepter in the other, and a laurel wreath on his head. And he would be painted bright red. A slave would stand behind him holding a golden crown ornamented with jewels. And according to Tertullian, early Christian writer, the slave would whisper in his ear, "Momenti mori," memento mori. Remember that you die. Remember you're just a mortal man. Why? Because in the midst of all this pageantry, where he's being dressed up as a god, he gets the red paint like the statues get. Um, he's feeling pretty proud of himself. He has to remember, though, that he's mortal still. He's not, he is going to die. He's not a god. He may become one, but right now he's not one. So the triumph would come into the city. Here's the route here, past the Campus Martius. The soldiers take up the rear as they enter into the city through the triumphal gate, and they're shouting triumph. They also shout abuse and obscene jokes at the emperor, probably to avert the evil eye. The procession, it winds its way through the city. It reaches the Capitoline Hill. The leaders were set aside and strangled and executed, and then sacrifices took place, and spoils were presented to Jupiter by the general. The laurel was put on the lap, the laurel wreath was put on the lap of the god. In some senses, you see that the general is being deified for the day, even though efforts are being made to remind him um, of his manhood. All right, I think that's it for today. Look for those handouts for sure, and don't forget to take your quiz and send it in to me uh, by the next day. Here's a coin before we leave showing the uh, triumph of Octavian. You can see the four horses and victory on a ship. This is 29 BC. So Octavian is coming back from victory in Spain.